as we start turning inside, most of what we see in the foreground is parts, and they're from our own personal lifetime history. And that's the vast majority of inner work is right there. But then you start going a little further, and then there's legacy burdens, stuff that did not happen to us, did not happen in our own personal lifetime, and yet has a huge effect on our feelings and behaviors. Now, there's hard science around this now. There's epigenetics, there's Rachel Yehuda's studies of the descendants of Holocaust survivors, there's the DS wrestler experiment, there's all sorts of stuff. So this is hard science. This isn't woo-woo at all. So most people accept, oh yeah, there's this too. Kind of weird, but there's science. There's also what Dick calls unattached burdens. Stuff in us that's not from our ancestors, that's not from our own personal lifetime, that has huge impacts on who we are and how we can operate in the world. And this, I did not want to believe this at all. And then I also have a little bit of graduate work in anthropology, which was my undergraduate degree. And they talk about this as spirit possession. Dick hates it when I talk about spirit possession. That's too, but I put it this way, and it helps some people. There is a basic biopsychological dynamic that is found in almost every culture and every era of history we have records of. This dynamic has profound effects on people's well-being for good and ill. The metaphor most often used to describe this is spirit possession.
Hey, curious people, you're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the Self-Led Sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. I'm really excited about today's conversation on the podcast with Bob Falconer, who is well known in the IFS world for his courageous exploration and writing related to working with unattached burdens and guides, and his other explorations. He's the author of 6 books related to IFS and inner healing. And his most recent is Self Unbroken, which will be coming out next month. His book, The Others Within Us, Internal Family Systems, Porous Mind, and Spirit Possession, offers a very unique peek into this layer of spirituality and how it intersects in some cases with sexual trauma. I'm excited to have this conversation because sexual well-being, sexual trauma, and just various states that can occur through sexual experience are ones that might be considered of porous mind. And I had an amazing conversation with Bob. So listen to your parts. There may be some things that are challenging or provocative, and I welcome, your curiosity and hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So I'm so excited to have a chance to spend this time today with Bob Falconer. And I don't even know where our conversation will go, but there is so much depth in your areas of expertise. So very excited. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So Bob, just to start out, I like to ask guests if they're noticing any parts as we step into this conversation.
I'm sad. There's a 12-year-old who's excited and eager to talk, and we haven't seen each other in more than a decade. So there's a fair amount of catching up we could do, but
Mhm.
that's probably not podcast material.
Yeah, well, welcome to your 12-year-old. And I'm remembering we met in my level three, which I think you may have done a lot of level threes at that point, but
Mhm.
it was my one and only. So that was in Boulder many years ago. So anything you could share with listeners just about kind of where you are in the world and also anything about your own identities?
Sure, I could go on for a long time. I'm an old fart. That's the first thing. I'm 78, and to my amazement, I'm more creative and productive now than I've ever been in my whole life. And that's been the case for the past 5 or 6 years. And I've published a whole bunch of books, and I'm doing a whole bunch of supervision groups and still seeing a few people. Mostly it's therapists bring me a client who they're really stuck with, and I work with the therapist and client together. So I find this stimulating, exciting, endlessly fascinating, and more I feel like a total beginner. After 50 years, I've achieved beginner status. And I used to think I was supposed to be some kind of expert, and that was actually a pain in the butt to try and be an expert. But being a beginner is fun. So that's where I am, and I could talk about my books and what I focus on, all that stuff if you want.
Sure. Yeah. Why don't you tell us about that?
Okay, the one that most people are aware of is The Others Within Us, which is about what IFS calls unattached burdens and guides, primarily unattached burdens. And all the vast majority of my career, I have focused on trauma because my own history was extreme sadistic physical and sexual abuse throughout my childhood. And so that was my focus. And I thought I sort of had the world, I had this trauma-oriented model of psychopathology and healing that I was fairly happy with when I was in my early 60s. And then this case, the woman had a very large, very aggressive, unattached burden in her. And in those days, we called them critters. And I was able to get it out, and it changed her life completely. And actually, I thought, it was so weird. It was so out of my universe. I thought, I'm just going to ignore this. I'm going to pretend this didn't happen. It doesn't fit. I've devoted my life to developing all this. It doesn't fit here. And then she sent me these emails that changed my life. One of them, she sent several, and I thought I'd triggered a manic episode because she was saying, I feel so good. I'm seeing colors I never saw. And then she sent one that she said, Bob, I didn't tell you this, but when I was a young woman, I tried to kill myself many times and I was institutionalized repeatedly. When I tried to tell people back then about the non-human in me, they gave me electroshock and injected me with horrible drugs. You're the first human being to ever believe me, and you have changed my life. And my response to that was very ungallant or ungentlemanly. I thought, oh shit, I can't ignore this now. And I followed that woman since then. That's close to 20 years ago now. She did blossom and flower both inside and outside after that. And it completely sort of reorganized my universe. And
But
like me, most therapists don't want to look at this. It's like, that's too weird. No. So I've gotten a tremendous number of referrals. So it became the focus of what I do for quite a while.
Bob, I'm wondering if for listeners who may not be
Hmm.
familiar, you could just briefly explain what you mean by the others within us or unattached burdens.
Okay. Okay. Um, Unattached burdens is a phrase Dick came up with that I'm not very fond of. But first of all, most of the stuff, as we start turning inside, most of what we see in the foreground is parts, and they're from our own personal lifetime history. And that's the vast majority of inner work is right there. But then you start going a little further, and then there's legacy burdens. stuff that did not happen to us, did not happen in our own personal lifetime, and yet has a huge effect on our feelings and behaviors. Now, there's hard science around this now. There's epigenetics, there's Rachel Yehuda's studies of the descendants of Holocaust survivors, there's the DS wrestler experiment, there's all sorts of stuff. So this is hard science. This isn't woo-woo at all. So most people accept, oh yeah, there's this too. It's kind of weird, but there's science. There's also what Dick calls unattached burdens. Stuff in us that's not from our ancestors, that's not from our own personal lifetime, that has huge impacts on who we are and how we can operate in the world. And this, I did not want to believe this at all. And then I also have a little bit of graduate work in anthropology, which was my undergraduate degree. And they talk about this as spirit possession. Dick hates it when I talk about spirit possession. That's too, but I put it this way, and it helps some people. There is a basic biopsychological dynamic that is found in almost every culture and every era of history we have records of. This dynamic has profound effects on people's well-being for good and ill. The metaphor most often used to describe this is spirit possession. Whatever metaphor we choose to use, it's important. We find it almost everywhere there are humans. It's worthy of study. So that's basically what I'm talking about.
So in this with the client you were talking about where you were in, can you say a little bit about what you were encountering, like what was happening? How could you tell this was different than the other categories you've mentioned?
Okay. Yeah, good question. Thank you. What I was actually supervising one of the practice groups in a training, and this guy was being the therapist, and the woman was in the role of client. And what was coming up there was what appeared to be a critic, and she saw it inside herself as a bloodshot eyeball. And then as she looked at it more and more, the bloodshot eyeball had the legs of a goat. So it was, quite visually intense. And I just got the sense that this was not a part. And I said because the guy was getting really frustrated, I said, would it be okay if I took over the session? And he said, yeah, please. The first difference, in IFS, we know that every part has a good intention, including suicidal parts. They're the last line of defense against intolerable pain, usually, often. So when it's one of these unattached burdens, they don't have a good intention. So I just kept asking it, well, what's good about that? What's good about that? And it just said things like, I want to destroy her. I'm going to crush her. I'm going to make her miserable until she dies, and on and on and on and on, and nothing, no good intent, no matter how careful we were. So then the next thing that Dick says and traditional IFS says, and by the way, he would train people in this. He knows it's real, but it used to be he'd only talk about it in level 3s because he thought it was too weird and freaked people out too much. So the next thing you do is you just ask it directly. You have the person ask it, are you a part of me? And they don't seem to be able to lie about this, but they'll try and avoid the question. Like it would say things to her like, I've been around a long time. That's not an answer. Are you a part of me? You wish I was a part of you. That's not an answer. Are you a part of me? And kept asking that, and I kept prompting her to do that. And at one point, it had her say to me, you're supposed to be a teacher. That's a really stupid question. Don't you have anything smarter to ask? And I said that I found that funny. And I said, well, it may be stupid, but it's simple. Are you a part of her? And eventually it roared out, no, I'm not a part of her. I'm a much more glorious being, and I'm going to crush you like a worm the same way I'm going to crush her. And no good intention, to put it mildly.
Can I ask how that felt? Did you get scared of it?
Not at all. I don't know why, but I didn't. And that fear and our being afraid or the client being afraid is a super important subject. It's the first thing you have to deal with is your fearful parts. But anyway, we were able using very simple means to get it out of her system. And just doing that is what transformed her life. And I didn't know, I knew almost nothing about this. I just had the very basic ideas from Dick, you know. When they have no good intention and when you ask them and they say, no, I'm not a part of the system, you just tell them you got to go now and you help them go out.
How
And
do you
then
help them? How do you help them? Can you give examples of how you could help it go out? Or in that
sometimes,
case,
yeah, the first thing you have to do, this is, I mean, I wrote a 450-page book with 32 pages of references to explain this. But to summarize that in a minute, sometimes you can use light, surround it in light, have it go. Sometimes you just tell it, you got to go now. It's over here. You don't, the, excuse me, the traditional exorcism or deliverance ministries fight it. And there's all this battle, and, I don't think you need that. Maybe never. But the vast majority of times, for sure, you do not need to fight it. What we do, it's very IFS. You find any parts of that person who wanted it for any reason or who were scared of it. And you have the person develop a self-part relationship with those parts until those parts connect with the person's self and no longer want that thing and no longer are scared of that thing. And when that basic kind of IFS work is done, there's nothing left for that thing to hook into or stay attached to. And then it has to go. And it seems to have free will, just like the client does. It can go to some healing realm or it can go back into the darkness. And some of them go away, shaking their fists and yelling swear words at us and we'll destroy you, we'll be back, I hate you, we'll tear you apart, all that kind of garbage.
yeah. So I want to invite listeners to just notice what's coming up for them as they're listening to you. And I'm
Any scary
guessing,
parts.
yeah, like for some people, they're already familiar with these ideas with you. You've really like have such a big influence on the IFS community, and a lot of people are familiar with these ideas, and others listening, this is going to, I'm guessing, be brand new, pretty outside of maybe your realm of experience. So just inviting people to notice your parts, what's here for you as you listen, and
Yeah.
all parts, welcome around this.
The
Yeah.
number one thing, Patty, about this is fear. That's how these things get power almost always, by scaring people and scaring parts of people. So the major, major work, and often the most difficult part for me and for clients, is finding the parts who are terrified and not bulldozing them or reburying them. That makes everything so much worse. Welcoming them home with love. And
So helping both within the therapist, within the client, to find all the parts that are fearful of this thing. And as I'm listening to you now, I can imagine like several layers of fears, that people may have. And in my work, I've encountered this in my work as well. And I have lots I'd love to bounce off of you about that a little bit later. But there's both the fear of the phenomena, just encountering something like this. And then there's the ones that are in the system that actually have been in relationship in some way to it, and it's
Mhm.
become like part of the environment in a way, or like
Yep,
there's a power dynamic with it. So the
yep.
fears might have to do with upsetting that power, getting punished or like lots of things,
Mhm.
right?
Yep, all kind of fears like that.
Yeah.
Dick used to say, I don't think this is true, but this is what Dick used to say. I'm not sure, I'm not quite sure what he is saying today, so I don't want to speak for him. He said these things get in because they usually offer power to the powerless. Some little kids being abused, no power whatsoever. Any sort of energy force person that says, I got some power, the kid's going to take that in, of course.
So that might be a great bridge right there into this, this particular podcast, and my particular area of interest has to do with bringing together IFS with various dimensions of sexual experience, sexuality in lots of different ways. And so I'm excited to then maybe bridge into, in particular, what does this topic have to do with sexuality? So we both have the sexual trauma
Mm.
piece, which is huge here, and then just all the other ways that people might experience and express their sexuality throughout life. Big topic, but as we start to lean in that way, you're talking about children being powerless. As therapists, I don't know of anyone who hasn't encountered clients who have sexual trauma to varying degrees, unfortunately. So
Yeah.
how does, do you want to start there? Like, how do dynamics around sexual trauma
Hmm.
relate with this topic?
Okay, yeah, super important. And as I think I mentioned, my own history is extreme sadistic childhood sexual abuse. And I wrote an autobiography about the early phases of my recovery from that 20, 30 years ago. And I'm going to have a new edition of that out in hopefully less than a month.
Oh, wow.
A second, and it's going to be titled Self Unbroken. Um, I'll just go into this a little bit because this is really the core, I believe. My recovery is the core of my ability as a therapist. The family looked good on the outside, middle class, went to church every Sunday, but dad would rape and molest me and my brother all the time from my earliest memories. And he very often had one of his gay lovers who were also child molesters living with the family and also raping us. Mom also sexually abused us. My mother was institutionalized a few times when I was a kid, and a few more times later. That was hushed up, which could be done back then. My brother died in a almost certainly suicidal accident when I was 16. My father was murdered a few years later, and by all odds, I should be dead or in prison or living on the street or something. We used to joke in treating survivors, oh, the women go to therapy, the men go to prison. But it's not funny. That's because it's too damn true. But anyway, so I was highly motivated to find recovery. And a really big part early on was meeting acid and psychedelics. That was an immense help to me, and I still think it's an important part of a lot of recovery. But so I went through all these different tried all these different treatment modalities, a lot of which were really damaging. And I think IFS is the strongest and the best that's available today for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. I think childhood sexual abuse almost literally injects foreign energies into the child's body and psyche. It can be these unattached burdens, it can be fragments of the perpetrator, can be all sorts of, but it's just a brutal invasion and punching through a person's psychic wholeness. So I think many, many, many of these things get into people that way. Another way they get in, which is kind of surprising, is kids who've had a lot of early surgery or hospitalization that requires anesthesia. Anesthesia seems to let these in. So I think a more general view might be that these things get into people anytime they're out of their bodies.
I'm thinking about just like that some sort of layer of our being, and I don't want to really only call it even protectors.
Hmm.
Like there's sort of just some layer of our psyche or our wholeness, right? And then just when that's breached, and it's sort of, I'm just picturing some sort of opening that happens, and there's just no, it's like an open door.
Yeah, a ripping open.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that I think that almost literally happens.
yeah, yeah.
And very often, I think these things, when these external energies get in there, they sort of try and pair up or become parasitic on the person's sexual energies. And I think this is a big way we get sexual perpetrators. I know, I don't remember who it was, and you'll probably remember this. They were talking about how various parts try to ally themselves with the person's sexual energies, because once they've done that, they can take over a person's system. I might have, this might be my idea, but I don't want to claim it. When someone's really, really angry and has really rage-filled parts, those rage-filled parts can try to ally themselves and merge with the sexual energy parts. And if that happens, you've got a rapist or someone who's sexually very, very, very aggressive. So I've come to think of it that people's parts and these unattached burdens and legacy burdens are all sort of trying to ally to get the sexual energies as their ally, because then that gives them power enough to take over the system and hijack the whole system.
That's interesting. I think about sexuality as such a powerful resource. It's just such a huge resource, and the parts kind of
Mhm.
quickly figure out how can I use this resource? Either how do I have to defend against it because maybe feels like a threatening energy in the system, or how do I utilize this resource? And so, yeah, that aligns there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to say something else because I've sort of left it out. Unattached burdens are only half the picture. Because I titled my book The Others Within Us, because there's also guides, guidance, contact to spirits in good ways. And I think I a lot of people don't agree with this one, but a lot of people don't agree with anything I say. So what the hell? I think the way that the unattached burdens get in is pretty much the same way that guides, guidance, spirit presence, all those kinds of experience happen. There's kind of a porosity of mind and opening. So it's not a bad thing. It's just, the more open you are, all these other influences are going to get
Mhm.
into you. And I think also these very benevolent guide energies can merge and ally themselves with our sexual energy. And then I think people have wonderful, wonderful, fulfilling, heart-centered love lives.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think about self energy in there as a
Mhm.
tremendous resource in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then how, I guess, there's like, we talk in internal family systems, we're focusing so much on the internal, but the environment is so important as well, and I'm just thinking about children and how open they are and perceptive and receptive to whatever they're exposed to. And so the problem isn't the openness, even though people may blame themselves for that. The problem is that there were not people in the environment that were keeping them safe and
Mhm.
helping them to recognize their own experiences and interpret them.
Yep. Yep. Oh, there's so much I want to say about what you just said. Well, I'll go back. I did a book on Emanuel Swedenborg and IFS. And what he talked about 250 years ago, that's almost exactly like IFS self, he called it the place of inflow. And he saw it as how the divine gets into us. And the way he sees it operating in people maps onto self beautifully. So I think self can be seen as an opening to a much vaster realm. And I know Dick's even said it sometimes, well, actually, maybe self is just a field and maybe there's only one, in his more mystical moments,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. Um,
Mhm.
I, th I think IFS has really developed the idea of multiplicity of mind and explored the implications of that. And I think that is revolutionizing psychotherapy in America. I think there's another step we need to go, which is I'm always want to push the edges. I'm never happy in the center of the stream. Mind is not only multiple, it's also porous. Now, William James, a long time ago, had a great metaphor for this. He said, we look like islands in the sea. We look very, very separate, but we're all bumps on the same seafloor. And Tanya Luhrmann, who's, I think, one of the greatest minds on the planet today, an anthropologist, she says we in the West have developed what she calls the citadel model of mind. Like we're this isolated thing surrounded by this nice bony structure, and everything inside here is private. It's our property and it constitutes our identity. She says people have only believed this seriously in the last 300-400 years in the West. And it's basically only the elites in the West who believe this stuff. And I've come to believe that this false belief that our minds are this fortress is the root cause of the epidemic of mental illness. It's that important. And if you look at people like Daniel Siegel with all his ideas about interpersonal neurobiology, he's talking about the same stuff, but from a totally neurology science base. And he makes the point, which I think is absolutely right. This citadel model of mind is so built into modern Western languages, the grammar and structure of our, we can't even think clearly about who we really are because our language prevents it. It has this in there as a presupposition. So I think this porosity of mind stuff is super, super, super important. And if you have this idea that, oh, our minds are porous, hearing voices is not weird. It's normative human experience. And I think we can say that with overwhelming evidence now. That's a porous mind. And the extreme cases of porous mind are schizophrenia and all sorts of really, really difficult phenomena. But this is the direction I'm moving towards. And this is what working with these unattached burdens has moved me in this direction. I think we have to recognize that this is normative and good. And I think we need to look more at the really, really deleterious effects of thinking that we're this citadel.
Well, I see implications of the citadel on people's sense of connectedness with partners and with their sexuality, because the idea that our sexuality is sort of this thing that's contained within us, as opposed to a way to tap into this field of connectedness among us.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. And there is a kind of body bonding. I don't know, this is probably from the 60s. We used to talk about body bonding when you made love to somebody, that there'd be this kind of bonding you didn't understand. But I think if you're thinking about that your spirit and your mind are porous and the two of them get so close and interact in those ways, of course there'd be bonding
Mhm.
and deep kinds of connection.
So that brings up something interesting, and I do want to come back to the sexual trauma in a minute because I have some questions there. But I see, I guess this is sort of a question about spiritual hygiene. You know, anytime we're open, if we're therapists and we're very open and empathic, maybe we're helping someone who has a lot of these things in their system, or
Mhm.
even just a person who's sexually exploratory and in different groups and settings or with different partners that maybe they have their own energies around them. Maybe they have some of their own darkness, whether that's from their own parts or they're carrying some unattached burdens. I feel like we can take those on. I'm interested, I guess, a bit in how a, I think we naturally can take those on, especially if we're particularly open. And
Mhm.
then how do we notice those? How do we clear our systems, perhaps before there's any negative impacts?
Great questions. The traditional way sort of looks like the Citadel model of mind. You make these boundaries. The witches, and I've studied a lot of the stuff they do in Mexico. They call themselves people of power down there who work with these, that they'll have magic circles and do all this stuff. I don't like that. I think that whole basic strategy is really flawed. And because it's basically a defensive structure, And anytime you're building a defensive structure, you're sort of burning up psychic energy in not a creative way. Also, we know in IFS that any protector tends to elicit from the environment what it fears the most. So if you put up all these defenses against unattached burdens, you're like turning on a light, going, "Whoo, I'm right here. Come get me, come get me, come get me." So you have to do more. The whole strategy is profoundly flawed at its basis. So what I prefer to do is to work with accessing self. And I actually use a meditation from a guy named William Baldwin, who was a fascinating man, I think. He was a dentist who learned hypnosis for pain control. And he started getting some very weird things going on in his dental patients. So he went back and got a PhD in psychology and then spent the rest of his life working with what we call unattached burdens. He developed this meditation, which I've turned into IFS, that he called the Seal of Light. And basically, you look down inside, you find the core of your life energy, which for us would be self. For most people, visualize this as a spark of light inside themselves. And then you just focus on that. You know, it's a law of inner physics. Anything you focus on will fill more and more of your attention. You just let it grow and fill your body. Just noticing any obstructions, blockages, any places it won't go. Like some people, there's a whole limb of their body. Abuse survivors, it often won't go into their pelvis at all. And then you let it go all the way to the skin as much as it will. And then you let it go poof out around a few feet around you, noticing any indentations or shadows, anything moving. And you just do that. And that gives you a map, a very, very valuable parts map. And I do it one outline front, one outline back. So you get this parts map front and back of what's going on in that person's system. But also, when you're full of that light, there's no room for any external energies to get into you. You don't need to be building these walls out here. And doing this, accessing the core of your own life force is good for you. It's very helpful, whether or not there's anything attacking you. So I prefer this as a method for safety. And if you practice this meditation, to really do it carefully and make the maps, and then there's a way I've developed of working with this special kind of map we could go into if you want. But it takes 20 or 30 minutes to do this, carefully and fully and to make the maps. But you can also, if you've practiced this, you can do it in a couple of breaths. So it becomes a real-time tool you can use. If you start noticing your client has a lot of invasive energies, let's call them, or whatever you want to, if you start feeling there's anything like that coming at you, you can do a quick version of this meditation. Feel that flow coming from your center out. And I think it's a much better way of being safe.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. I'd be interested in hearing more about that. We have time a little bit later. Yeah, interesting. So I think it's important, and just for listeners as well, just to take in that I think, that there are these methods and tools to access self energy, right? So that we're not just subject, because I think there could be for some of my parts, there's this idea that there's something I don't see, I can't tell it's there. It's, has some evilness to it, and it has sort of free reign to do what it wants. And unless I kind of know the secret recipe to kind of, keep it away. And so, this visualization, this meditation, I think just this idea of really being connected to our knowing who we are, maybe. And
Yeah. I think what you said is so important. The thing I would do with that is let's talk to the part of you who's scared of it. Self is not scared of it. And it's really important we meet these scared parts in a loving way. You're probably going to think I've completely lost it now, Patty, if you don't already think that. I actually think these unattached burdens are often well-disguised blessings. And here's why. I think they're like ants in the kitchen, and I've currently got ants in my kitchen. Ants in the kitchen are obviously not trying to help you out, but they will show you where you've spilled the food every time. It's like that with these unattached burdens. They will lead you to exiles and protectors in exiles who it might have taken years of therapy for you to find. But these things have a radar for them because they're parasites and that's what they want to feed on. So if somebody's going, "Oh, I'm so terrified, how do I fight these off?" How do you feel towards the part of you who's scared of them? And can that part unblend from you? And if the part can't, then we do direct access with the part, but basically coming back to that basic kind of IFS work rather than going into building all these magical defense systems.
Hmm.
And what,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's something I know you mentioned in your book and that I definitely see as clinicians, we might, from even the example you had in the practice group of this bloody eyeball, like imagery may come up, parts may be visualized and seem demonic, seem horrendous, and maybe what they say and do and how they act is awful, and people may try to throw them out.
that's the worst mistake you can make. We have to lean into over and over again, this is a part, until it's really, really clear it's not. And it's like with suicidal parts. A lot of people, if they have a suicidal part, all the other parts in the system will go, get that out of here. That's not part of us. Get rid of that sucker. Get rid of that. It's not. So you have to talk to the part. And the question I like to ask is, well, what's good about it? What's good about it if you could get her to suicide? And then, oh, she wouldn't be on the planet anymore. Well, what's good about her not being on the planet anymore? And you just keep going. If it's a part, eventually there'll be a good intention. You'll get to a realm of a good intention. She wouldn't be suffering anymore. And then you can join with that good intention, welcome that part in. But if it's some kind of external energy that's trying to get her to commit suicide, the bottom line would be something that means I win, or then I get to eat her, or so,
Yeah.
so it's intention. It's all about intention. What are these beings trying to
Mm.
do? And I've come to think that these things are almost always parasites now. There's one group of people who deals with this who calls them the feeders, that they feed on people's pain and negative emotion. There's a lot of other people who talk about these beings as parasites. Do you know, I'm going to go off on a side trend. I never color inside the lines, Patty. Desjardins, the idea of the noosphere, he said, well, there's a lithosphere. Our planet is made up of rock. Then there's a biosphere, all the life around it. And then he said there's a noosphere, which is the consciousness that's generated by all that life. And then he talked about the noosphere and how we interact with that. And he has a lot to say, deep, profound thinker. But anyway, this other guy who does it, he said any ecology of sufficient complexity has parasites. The noosphere has parasites. They're parasites of the mind. And he developed his own science, intersubjective parasitology.
So interesting. I have parts saying, well, what's the positive intent of parasites existing? Because it seems like part of the ecology there. But then I also want to take it back to some of these clients I work with and that I'm thinking about that have some of these energies in their systems,
Hmm.
who I guess one thing is that, and I just want to offer like my own valid, that you don't need my validation, but just like that I have had experiences that kind of corroborate things that you're talking about, and that how tender the work is finding the parts that feel that they need to be the food.
Yep. Yep.
They're the food, but they get attention by being the food in a
Oh,
certain
yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Right? They have a function. They feel like no one will pay attention to them if they stop being the food for this parasitic energy. And
Yep.
so that work that you described of really trying to help those parts notice self energy, to be invited to notice their own reality, is such tender work.
Yep. And I think, again, I don't think the core of this work, the turning point in doing this kind of work is not getting that external energy out of the person's system, which I thought it was everybody's, oh, that's what we're here to do, blah, 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 blah. I don't think so anymore. I think the real core of the work is what you were just mentioning, that very tender first connection to that part who's been trapped. Like this belief, if I don't feed that thing, that psychic parasite, nobody's going to pay attention to me. So it's the classic IFS thing. How do you feel towards that part? You get all the parts who are disgusted, afraid, angry, you get them all to step back. So the person's radiating self towards that part. But very often with this kind of stuff, that part cannot receive any self energy. So the first step, Michi Rose's drop technique, just offer the self energy as a few drops and see if it could take in one or two drops. Often with this stuff, even that isn't subtle enough. So I've been coming up with more and more subtle and gentle ways to offer self connection. One that seems to work really well for me is, can you offer your self energy as a gentle breeze, perhaps like the breeze after a rain when everything is fresh, new, clean, and sweet smelling? Would that part be willing to allow that breeze to blow over and around them? And then, if they say yes to that, would that part be willing to inhale? And then sometimes even that's not gentle enough.
Yeah.
The next one I've come up with, and I want more of these. If you or your listening audience has more, can you offer yourself energy as warmth? Perhaps like the warmth of holding a kitten or a puppy in your lap, or the warmth of a wood stove on a cold
Mhm.
night.
Mhm.
Because sometimes these parts can accept that connection as warmth. And then another one, and this is actually from a student of mine, you can offer the part one end of a golden thread, very thin golden thread, because that way they have agency because they can let go of the thread anytime they want. And I think the whole turning point, the very center of this work, is that first subtle, delicate, tender connection of reconnecting that part to the person's self. Once that's everything else is water down the hillside.
Well, I'm very excited about this because I want to share a couple things I've experienced in that meeting in that place. And then also I really want to ask you about this because I don't want to forget, because if I wait, I'll forget. What I often see is that some great, amazing miracle happens and that bit of connection starts to happen. That little part or the exile feels the self energy. I see the client's demeanor change. It's all of a sudden they're like there. And then roaring out comes something that will disrupt it.
Yep. Yep. Those dark energies don't like us doing this.
Right. So that's where it's like, oh, now I feel like my grandmother is here, or now I feel like my, grandfather is here, and or
Mhm.
like something very dramatic starts happening, or like they start some
Yep.
other part instantly gets scared and
Oh
queasy,
yeah.
or like I feel like I'm gonna puke, or like some like it's such a and sometimes I'm like, okay, like this is sort of like a big atmospheric shift, so that could be kind of destabilizing to the system because it's been organized in this other way. You
Yeah.
know,
I just
there's
want to
lots of
say
different things.
I've had maybe half a dozen clients actually puke when I'm doing this.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
I had one start bleeding profusely from her nose.
mm-hmm.
And it was so weird, Patty. I said, because the blood was running down her nose into her mouth. And I thought she must be tasting this, but she wasn't. So I pointed it out to her and she took a Kleenex and just shoved it up her nose. And the Kleenex became bright red. And she was talking. So this bright, bloody red Kleenex was flopping around like this. Oh, it's kind of hard for me to stay focused. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my part sometimes gets scared in a moment like that, like sometimes the fear can slip in if there's something very dramatic and feels,
Yeah.
biological happening.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And what I do now is when the fear parts come up in a session, I just ask them, please step back. I'll come deal with you right after the session.
Hmm. To
But
your
they,
own parts. You're saying that to your
yeah,
parts.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. 'Cause- And then I really have to deal with them. If I don't, they're not going to step back the next time.
Hmm. Yeah. So very vivid example of the blowback, right? Like how, but whether it's like an atmospheric change, I was just
Mhm.
on a plane actually recently, and this really sweet little boy got a note. The pressure changed, and his nose started bleeding, right? And so this is like a
Yep,
pressure change in the system, right?
yep,
That could cause maybe some of these things. But then
yeah,
this sometimes these sort of there's a sense that there is kind of like a kind of cackling witch in there
yep,
sometimes who's like,
yep,
you're not going to get away from me.
yeah,
And that's sometimes the fear of the part to feel self energy is that they know that they're like going to
yep,
there's a sense they're going to be punished for it.
yep. Or the witch will say something like, well, that person's only going to be around for another 30 minutes. I'll be here when this session's done and I'm going to get you.
Yeah.
All kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah. So when it's a complex system like that and you have a time limit, you can only be with the person so long, like just curious about helping. Do you slow down? How do you
Yeah.
deal with that? Help the client with
That
that witchy presence?
first thing is, I used to sometimes rush to get these things out because I didn't want to leave the client in that sort of half intermediate state. Any rushing with these things is a mistake. Any rushing at all. I don't, I will not allow myself to be rushed. And that what's the old saying? All haste is from the devil. I think that's almost literally true here. And there's ways at every stage of this work to reassure and stabilize the client. And one of the things I repeatedly remind people of is these things look great, big, horrifying monsters, but actually they're really terrified and small beings. Think about it for a minute. They're making their existence as a parasite, an unwanted inhabitant in somebody else's psyche. That's not something a powerful being would do. And they very often they refuse to answer questions, you know, and I just say, "Hey, think about this for a minute. Here's this being claiming to be powerful and threatening, and it's too frightened to answer respectful, direct questions. That's not really a powerful being. It's more like a schoolyard bully at best." And I've actually come to believe that the vast majority of these things are what the Brazilian spiritists would call lost souls, or people in the Far East call hungry ghosts. They're lost, they're desperate, they're starving, they don't know how to get where they need to be, so they somehow get attached to somebody's psyche and they just try and burrow in and be a parasite there. Where actually we can help them get to somewhere that's much, much, much better for them.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
the
yeah.
spiritists in Brazil say when you meet something like this in a person, they become your client, your patient, as much as the person who's in the flesh in front of you. I don't go quite that far, but I'm
Hmm.
leaning very much in that kind of direction.
Interesting. And I feel like the energies can be different. There's some that I think of sort of like squatters, you know, they just needed a place. Like they were in some sort of very dangerous scenario, some kind of flight, and they needed a place.
Mhm.
Um, and, but they're using resources and, they don't belong there, as opposed to like these sort of nefarious things. And kind of curious about family lineage, because I know we have the idea in IFS of legacy burdens,
Yeah.
which still kind of come from the lived experience of the peoplehood, like if
Mhm.
there's been scarcity of, famine or genocide or like different things, and whether like these unattached burdens can be intergenerationally transmitted.
Definitely, definitely, 100%.
Hmm.
They can be passed down as a legacy burden.
So it could be an unattached legacy bird.
Yeah, or
Would you
however.
call it that? Or
I think something super important you just sort of mentioned or pointed us to. I don't try and impose this theoretical framework on anybody. I want to use however they want to hold it. Most people in the West accept or will accept legacy burdens because there's all this scientific evidence and there's, DS wrestler experiment, and you can demonstrate this stuff with rats, which that's our standard of reality now. If you can do it with rats, it's real. So I don't need to talk about unattached burdens. Why why get into that kind of stuff? I've done a lot of work in Pakistan and they talk about jinn. I am absolutely fine talking about gin. I don't need, so I think it's incumbent on us to learn our client's language. I think that's a
hmm
super, super important point. And I never try and impose IFS language or unattached burden or any of that. I just try
hmm
and listen carefully and respectfully and learn their worldview and their language.
hmm Well, I hear the theme of cultural competence in there too, like in the sense of just really appreciating with your some anthropology in your background, that's good prep for this too, right? Like just really respecting all of that goes into how someone is meeting themselves in the moment.
Yeah.
And the
Oh,
frameworks
I
around
want
that.
I want to tell a story. First, I want to say I'm working in Japan now, and I love working with them, and there's a lot about listening to them. My wife is Korean, born, raised in Korea, so there's a lot. The Korean shamanic tradition is amazing and fascinating. The Mudang, they're almost all women, but that we could go on for hours there. I want to tell this story about Milton Erickson, the great hypnotherapist and psychiatrist. This is about respecting a client's language. He was put on a new psych ward, and this is back when they still warehoused people. And there was a guy who, for more than a decade, all they've been able to do with this guy, feed him, get him clothes. He'd come out, he'd stand in the hallway staring straight ahead, and he'd talk word salad all day. That's all the guy would do for more than a decade. Erickson comes out, sees him. After a few days on the ward, he just stands next to the guy, listens, and then he takes out a pad and starts writing down his word salad. And then he types it out and he studies it and he learns how to talk that guy's word salad. And then he comes back and stands shoulder to shoulder with the guy staring out straight in front and talks word salad to him. After only a couple of days, in the middle of his word salad, that guy turned to Erickson and went like this and said, "Cut it out, Doc." So it's heartbreaking to me. Just by learning that man's language, he broke through an almost over a decade long total isolation of another human soul.
Mhm.
We need to learn their language.
Absolutely.
And when I was being trained, I was trained that I was supposed to learn this hideous language of diagnosis, and then I was supposed to cram it down the client's throat, whether or not they liked it. And if they disagreed with me, that meant they were being resistant. I think that's complete garbage.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wanting to go to that tender connection again for a second. Like
Good.
that Milton Erickson did it in an interpersonal way, which is amazing. Although I'm not so sure the client liked it if he's saying cut it out. He wasn't giving him a kiss. And that connection to self, I found that often it's when I ask, the client's self who's noticing a part that's very vulnerable and isn't connected. First of all, just to really slow down, just to be in proximity,
Yeah, yeah,
and especially people who've had their personal body boundaries violated, just the idea of sending anything to the part, I don't actually encourage that. Not to send anything to the part, but just to sort of be a presence. And then asking the part if it would like to notice itself. Is there anything it might like to notice about itself in that moment? So maybe it's, food, maybe it's serving as food in some moment, but say while you're being food, And you can be food as long as you want to be food. I'm not going to make you not be food. I can't. But while you're being food, is there something you might notice about yourself? And just how does it feel to be food? Like any self-awareness, inviting that thing to have the part, to have any aspect of awareness of itself,
Hmm.
sometimes is like, it can be quite impactful.
Yep. Yep. I think of this from a slightly different language, but I think it's the same thing. I think of making sure that this part feels that it has agency and
Right.
doing everything we can to get the part to start to feel some agency and to honor that at every step of the way.
Absolutely. And differentiation comes in too, like to be able
Mhm.
to recognize that it exists in some way
Mhm.
beyond a sort of trauma bond, if you want to call it that, or like that
Yeah.
enmeshment with another part, or whether it's an unattached burden or a part in the
Mhm.
system that has a lot of perpetrator
Mhm.
energy. That was something else I wanted to ask you about, the perpetrator introjects, which you
Oh,
mentioned, and how to differentiate that.
very important question. Perpetrator introjects are probably the parts that are most often mistaken for unattached burdens or something alien to the system, something from outside the system. Perpetrator introjects are typically created something like this: the kids being abused, and who has all the power in the room? The perpetrator, all the power. So, some courageous and I think even heroic part of that kid goes out and takes in a bunch of that perpetrator energy in order to try and protect the rest of the system. And then the rest of the system hates this part for what it's done because it smells like the perpetrator now and seems like the perpetrator. So I think these parts are heroic, and sometimes they have literally saved the life of the child. And this immense heroic sacrifice they make, then they get hated by the rest of the system and buried in some prison in the sub-basements of the soul.
Mhm.
It is absolutely terrible if we make the mistake of going along with that and trying to throw that thing out, saying it's not part of the person's system. And the way you can, these things have a positive intention. And it usually isn't that, doesn't take that long to find it. They're trying to save that little kid's life.
Can you say a little more of how from the part's point of view, how it's trying to save the child?
The kid has no protection whatsoever, no power, no agency, no nothing. The only agency power in that room is the perpetrator. So it tries to get some agency and power to create boundaries for that kid by taking in perpetrator energy. So
Mhm.
it can stand up against the perpetrator energy, which is forcing its way
Mhm.
into the kid's system.
Yeah. Would you say that, I guess, something similar that I've seen is like the idea of like if I perpetrate against other parts in the system, I'm somehow preparing the child for the other, there's some feeling of like if I do this to myself, I'm less vulnerable
Hmm.
to what the other, the outside perpetrator is doing. These aren't conscious thoughts,
Yeah.
that a person would be aware of, right? But that when we listen to the part, there's some way it's almost trying to like do it first or like gain control
Mhm.
that way or
Toughen up the system.
Mhm.
Put them through boot camp so they
Yeah.
can survive. Yeah, stuff
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah. And I do think, again, I'm aware people have different, who are listening may have very different levels of experience and exposure to these terms in this model. But this idea of positive intent, is not to be confused with we like the outcome, like when we say
Yeah,
there's no bad part, this has caused a lot of confusion, I think, for people. It's not that we endorse harmful
yeah. Suicide,
behaviors internally or
self-mutilation.
externally, parts
Yeah.
that, cheat and steal and, do different things. But we're saying that when we can understand that there is underneath the behavior an intent, some positive intention for the survival of the person of whom it's a part.
Yeah.
That would be the
Yeah.
positive intention,
And then we can join with the positive intention
right?
instead of having to fight the negative byproducts of that positive intention.
So if someone is engaging in sex with someone, say they're in a partnered, I mean, it could be solo, self-pleasure, it could be
Mhm.
with someone else, and they're kind of like starting to feel good, and then they get blasted with some kind of shame, like all that stuff gets stirred. Of course, this is a big thing. There's all sorts of things that people have related to trauma.
Mhm.
But because of your expertise, I'm kind of curious if you feel like there's or have seen maybe unattached burdens that come in with specific triggers, like they're activated by someone moving
Mhm.
towards sexual pleasure.
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think I think a lot of sex addiction comes out of this kind of stuff. They're unattached burdens who just want to feel sexual arousal, and they don't care what the cost is. And they don't care who it's with. And if they get into a person and they can join, if they can connect with that person's sexual energy and maybe recruit a couple other parts, you've got a sex addict
Mhm.
or someone who is wildly promiscuous.
Yeah.
And, there's quite a few people who think many addictions have this component, you know, that
Mhm.
there's some external energy that, like wants that drug high or wants, whatever it is. So when it sees somebody engaging in those behaviors, it will come in, tend to make it more extreme.
Interesting. Yeah.
There's a guy named Stafford Betty who's written novels about this, of these spirits of alcoholics coming into somebody who's starting to drink too much and turning them into a total alcoholic.
Interesting. Yeah. And again, I just want to reiterate what you were saying earlier about, to me, there's a value in recognizing this realm and these possibilities and sort of in a way just making it less scary or unfamiliar, but also not rushing, as you were saying, into interpreting every scenario as coming in this way,
Yeah.
as boiling down to this level of things, because I feel like, people can have so much fear of, especially if they're raised maybe in a very moralistic, high control religion, or, have certain circumstances growing up that there's so much good bad dichotomy and polarization and so
Hmm.
much terror of a sexual impulse, that then it can seem sometimes as though it's alien because it's been
Yeah.
so disowned in their culture and in their own upbringing. So it
Hmm.
feels like it comes from the devil or whatever. And,
Hmm.
so how do we help people to like befriend and get to know what's their own body, what's their own natural
Hmm.
experience? And then when are these occasions where maybe there's
Yeah.
something at this level?
Yeah. I would again assume it's a part, assume it's a part, assume it's a part, assume it's a part a few more times.
Yeah.
Dick used this phrase I love, and that this is something they say in med school all the time. When you hear hoofbeats, do not think of zebras. You know?
Exactly. Yeah. So I want to ask more about the guides side of this.
Great.
And there's in the context of unattached burdens, maybe guides have a role coming in, but then maybe someone doesn't really have unattached burdens. How do people, this maybe might get more at the Swedenborg stuff, the divine inflow, like, you
Hmm.
know, what are some ways, this is like not a short question, whatever comes up for you around this, how do we understand that? How do we greet that? How do we make room for that?
Okay. Great questions. I'm writing a book on this. I'm actually writing two more books right now, which is insane. But that's me. The Swedenborg book was so successful that they wanted to do another one. So we're doing a second volume on Swedenborg and modern healing. And The other book I'm writing is about welcoming in these big spiritual energies, or whatever you want to call them, transpersonal energies or anything like that. The reason I titled my first book, The Others Within Us, I don't like the fact that in IFS we go unattached burdens guides. We have to judge something, whether it's good or bad, right when we meet it and name it. I don't like that. I want some neutral term. So the others within us, that's just sensing some presence within you that's not really who you are, or in some way, or seems bigger or foreign to who you are. It could be legacy, it could good, bad, because there's also legacy blessings, heirlooms, so all of that. I think everybody has this, but I think we just block it out. And this is another place where I think IFS is incredibly valuable for the traditional spiritual ways. Thanks to IFS, we can know about parts, and we can help a person develop a good inner family system, a loving system of parts within themselves. And then that allows us to go toward the realm of these other beings and be pretty clear as to what's ours and what's something bigger than us. The other part about IFS that's so helpful here is IFS is a constraint release model. We don't go into the spirit gym and start working out our spirit muscles and figure we're going to get bigger and more powerful. And there are many, many, many spiritual traditions that do that. That's not the IFS way. It's not my way. The IFS, Dick says the whole model is constraint release. If we're looking for connection to a higher power, or whatever you want to call spirit, you look for what's blocking it. It's like that seal of light meditation I was talking about. You're just looking to meet all those blockages, to having that light expand and fill you. And then you work with each one in a loving, kind way to get, so you're releasing the constraints, you're releasing the blockages. You're not trying to power past them or crush them or anything like that. In traditional spirituality, there are two terms that refer to kinds of spirituality that are like this: kenosis, Kenosis, and they're historians of religion and people who study comparative religion who talk about the kenotic traditions in pretty much every religion. Every religion has this kind of spirituality in it somewhere. The other name they use a lot is apophaticism. I like big fat words. When I co-authored that book with Dick, he crossed out almost every big fat word I put in there, which was a drag for me. But apophaticism came originally from theology, and it meant the attempt to describe God by saying what he is not, because what he is or she is too big. You can't, no word's going to fit. So you say what it's not. That's the same sort of thing about this approach to guides, spirit, higher power, whatever you want to call that experience,
Mm.
is working, getting stuff, the clouds part and self is there. It never even got dirtied. Even through the most horrendous abuse, it's there undamaged. That was such a healing message for me from IFS and for the guys I worked with.
That's
So,
huge. That's huge. And I'm so glad you've stated that here. I know we're coming toward the end shortly. And just to remember that we already have this in us.
yeah.
And if we're talking about sexuality, I talk about sexual self energy, the idea that we have this energy, our self energy has qualities that are pleasant. It feels good. It feels good to
Yeah.
embody our self energy. It's not here to hurt us. And that we don't have to go looking and building, right? But
No.
finding the barriers.
Yeah. I find that many, many people have an incredibly hard time tolerating joy. Incredibly hard.
Yeah.
And I think, I have to cause a little trouble. I think The 8 C's are way too small, way too small. I'm pretty sure Dick intentionally dumbed them down to make them acceptable. We need words in there like wonder, awe, ecstasy, euphoria, all its vastness, luminosity, it's all in that direction. And I don't think it's possible to heal from major trauma without connecting to this realm of spirit, of vastness, luminosity, wonder, awe, all of that.
Mhm.
Uh, I love the 12-step phrase, higher power. We need that. That's life-giving. And I think sexuality can be a major doorway to that for many, many people, these transcendent experiences.
Well, we agree on that. Yeah. Wow. Is there anything you want to add to our conversation? Anything you haven't had a chance to say?
Well, one thing, I don't know what your audience is like. I don't want to leave people feeling frightened by this material. It's actually very freeing. When I first ran into it, I didn't want to have anything to do with it. It was so weird and, disorienting. But actually, I think it can help us feel even more stable and even more. I think of it sort of like, those seaweeds that attach to the rocks on the bottom, and no matter how bad the storm, they just turn all that violent energy into this wonderful wavy motion. I think when we can connect at these depths to these deeper energies, we become like that seaweed, and it gives us a whole new level of stability and flexibility. And so I don't want to leave people thinking, oh my God, there's all this garbage around here. I
Hmm.
have to defend against.
Yeah.
No, there's
Yeah.
an opportunity for a much more profound and flexible connection to who you really are at your depths.
Yeah. And I hope this doesn't take us in open another can of worms here as we're winding down, but I can't help but think about kind of the political climate and all these sexual predator, these rings of sexual predators, like this hu- very huge macro level of dark energy around this stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And how important it is, I think, this hopeful message, to feel like there is some sort of counterweight to that, as much as it can be very overwhelming to take in, the scale of some of these things that we're reading about.
Okay. I want to say a couple things here. I think a large part of our planet is dominated by these dark energies, including our political structures, our schools, our churches. You think of priests molesting the altar boys, that's pretty dark. But I'm actually, even though that's the case, I'm fundamentally optimistic and joy-filled. And here's why. I think the only way we can change this, it's so dark and so ubiquitous. The only way we can change this is by working with one person's consciousness at a time, or a few people in a small group, the kind of work we do, one on one. And that was leaving me feeling fairly dark. But I was listening to Ian McGilchrist, who I think is one of the greatest minds alive on our planet today. He's really brilliant. And he was saying the same thing. But what he said, we don't need to change 50% or 51%. If we could only get to about 3% of the people on the planet and have them deeply change their mind, this more this more aligned consciousness is so powerful, so contagious, and so beautiful. 3% is plenty that can transform the world. And I think, hey, 3% is doable. If we just stay focused on this one and one, heart-centered, warmly connected, we can do that. That's, so that help me stay I am very optimistic. And something Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said like, I don't know, 50, 100 years ago now, don't ever doubt that a few dedicated people can change an entire culture. Matter of fact, it's the only thing that ever has.
Beautiful, beautiful words to be concluding with. I felt my proverbial chills that I get, like sometimes something, there's some truth exchanged or
Mhm.
witnessed, and I just really felt a lot of somatic corroboration there
Good.
with you saying that.
And it gives me optimism and joy in the work I do.
Yeah. So we'll have things in the show notes, but do you want to say anything aloud about how people can find your work?
Yeah, website robertfalconer.us. There's all sorts of free stuff. The big research-centered book on unattached burdens and guides is The Others Within Us. And that I published, I don't know, 4 or 5 other books recently in the past few years.
Awesome. And I do like to ask guests at the end of our conversation if you'd like to share something that you find pleasurable in life.
Oh, there's so much. One thing I do pretty much every day that's weird, I didn't want to let you down, Patty. I get up before dawn every day and I go outside and I dance with the trees. And that gives me immense pleasure. And they never complain about my dancing.
Well, that's awesome. That is awesome. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for visiting, for sharing your wisdom, for that beautiful personal
Oh,
practice you have, and leaving us with that as well. So, just offering you lots of gratitude.
thank you. Great to be with you. Let's meet again. Let's not let 10 years go by.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Until next time.